So it's finally here. After 70 hours of grinding, I've finally beaten Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Hello everyone, I'm lockheartQT, and today I'll be giving you a full spoilers review of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. If you want my non-spoilers take of sort of the first moments and first half of the game, you can check it out here on screen, or there'll be a link in the description so you can go check it out there if you don't want any spoilers. And of course in this video I'll be covering the entire game. Story, side quests, ending, end credit scene, and that dreaded particular scene, which will be all time-stamped on screen, so don't worry. But obviously this will be your last spoiler warning, so if you don't want any spoilers, if you're going into the final game blind without any more delays, here is my spoiler warning and here is my full review of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So what did I think about the overall story? Well, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth takes place moments after the end credit scene of Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, with the gang starting off in calm and then making their way through the events of the rest of Disc 1 and Disc 2 of the original Final Fantasy VII story. Overall, I thought the story here was a lot better than Remake's, as this game not only incorporates the events and locations that shaped the original release of Final Fantasy VII, as in the remake we only got to see Midgar, but this time around we get to see pretty much most of the world. We get to see Calm, Costa del Sol, Nibelheim, the Golden Saucer, and much more. Speaking of which, the game opens up with a retelling of the original Nibelheim incident flashback scene, which was fantastic. Just seeing this scene and event in the, Final Fantasy VII story remade was fantastic as a fan of the original game, and it also worked extremely well as a beginning tutorial, so much so that Square Enix made a free playable demo around it. The game from there sets off with the party setting off into the wide world, and overall I thought the storyline was great. I do have some gripes with the ending and the build up to it, which I'll get into later on though, but the storytelling in Rebirth does lean less into the new things introduced in Remake, such as the Whispers and Arbiters of Fate and all of that, which in my opinion were a bit on the nose in Remake and I didn't like them as much as the older elements. But other than closing chapter, the game hardly features the Whispers and things like that. It does feature them quite a lot in the last two chapters, but sort of early on they're only featured or mentioned a couple of times, and they're just not as featured as much as the remake, and instead it gives us a closer remake of the events of the original story. Yes, you'll still be rounding up Chocobo at the farm, meeting Hojo on the beach surrounded by models, yes, Cloud still has his degradation effects, and yes, there is still that infamous date scene at the Golden Saucer. But the new stuff from Intergrade and Final Fantasy VII Remake is also given individual spotlights to pad out the game time. Johnny returns, for example, with scenes that actually got a chuckle or two out of me, with a sort of very amusing side quest of Johnny building his own inn in Costa del Sol. You've got Kyrie and many more new characters from Final Fantasy VII Remake returning with stuff to do and say, and none of it felt out of place or forced into the original narrative of the original story, and instead most of it is actually given its own time and place in the story. Overall, the storyline in my opinion was mostly faithful to the original events, with locations such as Fort Condor, Rocket Town, Wutai, and more obviously being saved for the third game, as a few of the locations obviously did feature in this point in time in the original game and are obviously being saved for the third game, and in my opinion that's completely fine with how they told the events in Rebirth. So, the gameplay of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is fantastic and extremely replayable. The overall mechanics and combat remains the same as Final Fantasy VII Remake, with the command deck and action hash and slash combos, and it still works extremely well. Yuffie returns with her gameplay kept pretty much identical to Intergrade, and they've actually built upon it, and even Red 13 joins in with an interesting gameplay style focusing on countering his enemies. But that's not to say Rebirth doesn't do anything new. Rebirth builds on Remake's gameplay formula by including combat settings. You can actually go in and select a party member and you can mix and match your party like you can in the original. For example, if you want a party consisting of Red 13, Yuffie and Aerith, you can do so and you can sort of mix and match who will be your party leader and your build up, and obviously you can change their individual weapons, materia and whatnot. You also have brand new synergy attacks. These are attacks where you have to build up ATB meters with both characters, and you go to synergy settings in the the command deck menu, and you can select a special attack that does quite a few things. You can either select a attack that does, for example, more damage than usual, similar to a limit break or an ability such as Braver, for example. You can select ones that give you infinite MP for a short amount of time, or you can even select ones which give you more ATB gauges. And you can, fully customize this with a skill tree of sorts, and you can go into this and unlock new ones as you get into the end game. And especially in the end game, some of these are absolutely broken towards the end of the game, especially with characters such as Yuffie being really good for obviously DPS, and characters such as Tifa being really good for staggering enemies very quickly. And since this game explores the rest of the Final Fantasy VII world, there's returning and new gameplay elements thrown in for good measure. In Rebirth, you'll never know what to expect next. The original Final Fantasy VII had loads and loads of mini-games and side content thrown in, and Rebirth takes this concept and ramps it up to 11. Other than snowboarding, which is sadly missing, in Rebirth you'll be riding segways in Costa del Sol, performing in a rhythm minigame during either the Golden Saucer play, which is obviously a retelling of Loveless, or you'll also be doing a similar rhythm minigame during the Presidential Parade in Upper Junon. You'll be surviving a froggy obstacle course in Lower Junon, exploring all of the mini-games and side content and games in the Golden Saucer, with some elements even returning from Remake, and what I mean by that is the brand new mini-games that were introduced in Remake, such as for example the G-Bike element from the original, but something new. If you want something new that's returning from Remake, you have an updated version of the crate smashing minigame, which is really great in my opinion, and Rebirth will definitely keep you on your toes and you definitely won't be bored, as there's just loads of new stuff thrown at you every 5 minutes and it doesn't feel overwhelming, and it's just really fun and makes the game even more replayable. So a big part of the story and gameplay I failed to mention was the open world of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. You see, in the original Final Fantasy VII game, Midgar was only really the first 3 to 5 hours of the game, and then the game's open world opened up after you leave Midgar. This is why there was so much controversy when Remake was originally announced, because as soon as Square said, oh, the first game is only going to be Midgar, everyone was understandably upset, as some of the best elements of the original Final Fantasy VII take place in sort of the middle installments of the game, and Rebirth carries these elements across very well. Now, the game isn't fully open world like the original Final Fantasy VII, but it contains different open regions, so it's basically semi-open worlds. These open regions include towns, cities, open fields that you can explore, and landmarks from the original game, such as Cosmo Canyon, for example. They definitely took cues from Ubisoft-style games with the Yakuza series as well, and even Square Enix's own Final Fantasy XV. In these open regions you can fully explore the map to find treasure hideouts, fight special enemies as well as bosses, follow baby chocobos to find fast travel bus stops, unlock towers to reveal more of the map similar to Ubisoft open world games, and much more. There's so much that in this game that I can't talk about it, or I'll be here for 40-50 minutes talking about everything you can do in the open world. You can gather ingredients for crafting, and there's just so much more to do. Speaking of which, chocobos are fully rideable in this game, and yes, even Red 13 can ride a chocobo, which definitely looks bizarre at first, but chocobos can actually be used for finding hidden collectibles by sniffing along the ground and following a trail, getting from here and there faster and travelling along the map a lot faster, as well as using unique chocobos to climb walls, float on water, gliding mini-games, and so much more. And yes, of course, I know many of you are more wondering if you played the original, Chocobo Racing does in fact return in Rebirth, and I'm not going to lie to you, it's literally Mario Kart. Square Enix could make their own side game for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is just the Chocobo Racing mechanics. There are so many more races, and a few of them remastered from the original Final Fantasy VII and remade. And Chocobo Racing, I'm not gonna lie, it got me hooked. I spent most of my playthrough playing the Chocobo Racing minigames and 100%ing all of them, and it just made me, I'm not gonna lie, it put a massive smile on my face. Overall, it was jaw-dropping as a Final Fantasy VII OG fan. Final Fantasy VII, the original, was one of the first games I ever played on the original PlayStation, and to see this map, iconic locations, and mini-games from the original completely remade, and the overall design of these regions as well were extremely well thought out with how to connect all of these locations from the original. For example, you go from Corel to Gongaga, for example, and you have a jungle environment, and you have the grasslands as well as Junon connected by the mithril mines like in the original, and it's just so well thought out and well designed. So I'm going to rip this spoiler band-aid off right away. Yes, unfortunately both Cid and Vincent Valentine from the original are not playable in Rebirth, and although it's a little upsetting because I actually went into this game thinking that they would be playable in some capacity, I think they did an alright job of explaining why they aren't playable here, whilst also giving them something to do in the narrative. For example, with Cid later on in the game, you actually get to pilot the tiny Bronco both in the air and on the sea, and it even gets his own little side quest, so technically you can play as Cid but not in a combat setting, and this definitely gives the credence that both characters will be playable in the third installment. Speaking of which, the OG party members return from Remake, and they all have something to do. All of the original characters, so Tifa, Barrett, Cloud, Red 13, Yuffie, etc., all feel extremely important and are given individual segments in the story focused on them and their own individual side quests, where you can build up a background feature of character relationships, where all of Cloud's actions and individual decisions, because yes, there are actually branching decisions in this game, nothing as complicated as something like Mass Effect for example, but all of these actions and decisions are tallied up in the background to determine his individual relationships with individual members of the main party, as well as determining who Cloud will get in the Golden Saucer date scene. And without spoiling these too much, these scenes actually shocked me on how far they went, shall we say. I'm not going to spoil the one that I had. For example, the date scene I got was with Tifa, because Tifa's best girl, and it was shocking to say the least, in a good way. Like, it was very well done. It was almost fan service to a certain level. So here's where we sadly get some gripes with the game. So for context, I played this game on a 4K display on PlayStation 5, and I actually had quite a few issues. In terms of performance, in terms of things like frame rate dropping, I didn't really have anything like that, but originally, up until Costa del Sol, I played the game on performance mode, as I usually play games with a higher frame rate. Performance mode runs at 1080p 60 frames per second, but it graphically had loads of issues playing on this mode. The game playing on performance mode looked extremely blurry, grainy, and just not up to par with current gen games performance modes for example, and I actually had to force myself to switch to the higher fidelity mode halfway through the game around Costa del Sol on my playthrough, which capped obviously the game at 4K 30 FPS and drastically improved the graphics, textures and lighting. And I'm not gonna lie, other than, playing the game at a lower frame rate, this pretty much fixed most of my issues that I had. And I'm normally, like I said, a person who prefers higher frame rates to resolutions, but trust me, at the moment, until it's fixed, playing this game on 4K at 30 FPS is the way to go, as the game just looks night and day in terms of performance and, how the game generally performs really. And Square Enix have even addressed this issue publicly as soon as the game came out, and are quickly looking to make a patch to fix this mode ASAP. But in terms of music though, the soundtrack is orgasmic and mind-blowing, which I'm so glad to say that. All tracks returned from Final Fantasy VII Remake, including, you know, the new stuff that they added, as well as adding new iconic tracks based on the locations, for example, such as Costa del Sol, Cosmo Canyon, Calm, Nibelheim, and many more returned with fully remade tracks that hit that nostalgia feeling hard, whilst also feeling like something brand new, and they can definitely stand on their own as these new individual tracks. Plus some of the new tracks feeling great as well, with a very special shout out to the dog escort mission theme. Take a listen. So the ending, again, this is going to be your last chance for major spoilers, because I feel like I've, you know, gone into that in depth, but if you're still here then you probably don't care, so here we go. The ending of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth had me with very mixed opinions. In my opinion, playing things like Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy games, Square Enix, in terms of creating endings that are either really good, like something like Final Fantasy XVI's ending, or in my opinion quite bad with something like Kingdom Hearts 3's ending, for example. And the game ends with one of the most iconic scenes in video game history, Aerith's death scene. This scene, in my opinion, is the most heart-wrenching, gutting death scene in any video game, and I think for Rebirth they fumbled this scene so hard and just made it so confusing for no reason. It's like they couldn't decide whether to fully commit to killing Aerith and keep it similar to the original story, or change her fate entirely, so they actually resorted to a confusing middle ground that satisfies neither decision. You see, in this game, Cloud, for a moment, it actually seems like he saves Aerith, but it's then later revealed that Aerith's dead anyway, and it was just confusing shots and editing and chopped editing. It just made no sense, and personally I would have preferred a definitive moment where Aerith either outright died like in the original, or maybe a new ending and a new sort of branched timeline, for example, where we actually get to save her, because obviously the whole point of Remake's ending is the fact that we get to change the character's fate and we've changed the timeline and the story. So this kind of alluded to the fact that we could possibly save Aerith, and Square Enix actually even teased this when Remake, you know, ended and obviously Rebirth continued, you know, the marketing for it. They did tease the fact that this scene was going to be in the game and it would have had a new ending. And unfortunately they didn't really commit to an ending, and it just made it super confusing. Instead, we got a scene which felt very confusing, with the multiverse elements and the whispers and defying fate, and the wasted potential of the alternate universe Zack Fair's return. Zack felt a bit tacked on, and other than fighting with Cloud to save Aerith's fate, which obviously was completely meaningless, and it felt like he could have easily not been there at all. Where it was definitely cool to see alternate scenarios and Zack being playable once again, I would have loved it if Zack came into Rebirth's universe properly full time. I think that would have made a great ending if, for example, Sephiroth comes down to kill Aerith, and then maybe Zack is the one to save Aerith and fights alongside Cloud. I feel like that would have been, you know, a better scenario if they wanted to actually go that route. Either that, or if they just kept it one-to-one with the original. In terms of the actual ending, it definitely has me excited for the final installment, which is probably going to be called Final Fantasy VII Reunion or Revengeance or whatever it's going to be, with Cloud having the black materia, slowly losing his mind under Sephiroth's control, and he's probably going to, you know, betray the characters at some point and give the black materia to Sephiroth, as well as being able to see a dead Aerith in the livestream like in the original. Plus we'll most likely see the Highwind being explorable and playable maybe, as well as Sid Highwind and Vincent Valentine fully playable in the final installment, so I can definitely say I'm invested. Plus we'll probably most likely get snowboarding and more things to come in the next 4 years, which is going to be quite funny, the fact that we've gone from mourning our friend and, you know, dear character Aerith to then suddenly going snowboarding, so it's going to be very interesting to see. So in terms of final verdict, if I had to give a sort of review score to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I'd give it a solid 9 out of 10. The gameplay is extremely replayable with loads of content to explore and replay. The soundtrack is extremely memorable in its own right. Characters get their individual moments to shine, exploring more of what made them so iconic in the original Final Fantasy VII, but what stops me from giving this game a 10 out of 10 is the performance issues at 1080p 60 frames per second, just again looking really blurry and weird, the confusing mess of the story of Aerith's death, with all of the stuff with the whispers and multiverse elements and Zack and the confusing shots that in my opinion just don't work as well as the original death scene in the original story, as well as a few other gripes I had. When you're exploring Gongaga, in terms of this region, in my opinion it was extremely convoluted and confusing design wise and frustrating to navigate as an open world. Obviously if you're going to gain all of the collectibles and chocobo spots and things like that, in my opinion Gongaga was just a bit of a mess to explore. And also the fact that, this is another gripe I had, the fact that you have to listen to Chadley every 5 seconds. Here's a really good example. But nevertheless, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is an unforgettable experience. And I'm not gonna lie to you, like pretty much most of the game, I'd say up until chapter 13, I was dead set on giving this game a perfect score, a 10 out of 10. It's that good. But a few things obviously that I've already mentioned, but it was the main ending scene with Aerith that really, got me to decide, no, I need to take this down a level to a 9 out of 10. But like I said, nevertheless, it's an unforgettable experience which instilled me with loads of nostalgia. That was a big thing, I'm a fan of the original Final Fantasy VII, so much though that I actually have a Final Fantasy VII tattoo from the original game. And, whilst they throw in some new elements, such as, for example, the Johnny side quest and a lot of stuff that they did in Costa del Sol, and, pretty much throughout the game. For example, Queen's Blood. I didn't even talk about Queen's Blood, which is just an amazing, very addictive card game that's in the game. Make Final Fantasy VII Rebirth a must-play experience, and I definitely give it my seal of approval and definitely recommend it to anyone. If you're a fan of Final Fantasy, a fan of JRPGs, a fan of the original game, or if you've never heard of Final Fantasy VII and you just want to go in and play it, I definitely recommend this game. Anyway everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. Please tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I'd really like to hear from everybody on what your thoughts are on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as well as this review. I apologise it's taken a while. I've had to play the game on top of doing other stuff in real life, and like I said, it took me about 70 hours to do most of the content and story, and I haven't even 100% of the game yet, so I've probably got another 20 or 30 hours to go yet. And thank you so much for watching, and for more Final Fantasy VII Rebirth content as well as gaming content in general, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.